everyone. I'm Sister Vassa, and in this video, I will be sharing with you a talk I presented recently at the University of Exeter in the UK on the topic, The Role of the Russian Orthodox Church in the War Against Ukraine, a story told in pictures. I want to warn you, dear viewers, before we begin, that I will be sharing with you some distressing information and unpleasant images, which in Russian terms one could describe as offensive to the feelings of the faithful, оскорблением чувств верующих. However, if you watch the video to the end, together we will see how the overall picture of this stage in the history of our church is not bleak, but quite the opposite. Our time, I will suggest to you, is not a time of despair or to fall into disbelief or indifference, nor to deny what is happening as if it is not happening, or to check out altogether by leaving the church. Now is a time of growth, as in any time of crisis for those who believe, and as I will be demonstrating in this video. So together we will experience several descents into hell, so to say, but we will also be emerging from there, turning towards the light, towards our common hope and our faith in our crucified and risen Lord. So with that in mind, let's now begin. The story of the Russian Orthodox Church's role in the war against Ukraine can best be told in pictures. This is true not only because of the importance of images and photographs and videos in our internet age and social media culture, in which images are the window through which we receive and pass on information. This is also true because of the central role of images in Eastern Christian tradition. In this tradition, common both to Russia and Ukraine, visible images or icons are considered windows into an invisible reality, symbolizing or bringing together the visible reality with an invisible one. Of course, the visible images require words that interpret or explain their not visible meaning. So, in what follows, I will be presenting images and offering explanations to them. The disturbing thing about the images of the Russian church's role in the war is that they often connect traditionally Christian symbols with anti Christian meanings, and vice versa. They connect anti Christian symbols with Christian meanings. As the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church provides justification and support to Putin's war, it places in the service of the Putin war machine an entire symbolic system, including churches, icons, saints, elders, and quotes of the elders, prayers, sacraments, church canons, church history, biblical narratives, and their own hierarchical or clerical office and authority. The Moscow Patriarch Kirill and others with him utilize these symbols either to justify the war or to sacralize it, as we will see below, as some kind of guarantors of victory for Putin. They manipulate Christian symbolism to two ends or two purposes. Number one, to serve a criminal yet nominally Orthodox Christian regime, and number two, to secure and elevate their own place in it. The patriarchate justifies the resulting bloodshed, that is, the now estimated 500,000 casualties and counting of this war, in a way reminiscent of the concerns voiced by the chief priests at the time of the earthly life of our Lord Jesus Christ. Quote from the Gospel according to John, chapter 11. If we leave him like this, the chief priests and scribes reasoned about Jesus Christ. If we leave him like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation. And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish. End of that quote. As mentioned above, the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in the Putin regime's war against Ukraine presents us with a strange amalgam of Orthodox Christian and not Christian symbols and meanings, reflecting the peculiar religiosity of the Moscow Patriarchate under Patriarch Kirill and of the Putin regime, of which he is a part. Here is the first example of this mixed marriage of Christian and anti Christian perspectives. It is a children's book that was recently published at the end of November 2023 by the publishing department of the Moscow Patriarchate, and the book is entitled Жить, Родине служить. To live is to serve the homeland. This children's book, whose main editor is a bishop of the Moscow Patriarchate, Bishop Nikolai Pogribnyak of Balashikha, is a collection of quotes about service to one's fatherland and to one's state authorities, with a focus on military service, and also about service to God. In the very first section, entitled God and the Fatherland, Бог и Отечество, there are selected quotes from scripture and elsewhere about all power or all authority being from God. For example, Romans 13, verses 1 to 5, about being submissive to state authorities and about there being no authority but from God. And there's a quote of unknown origin which says, God gives power to whomever he wants. Бог дает власть кому хочет. Most sections of this children's book are for encouragement in military battles against quote unquote enemies of our fatherland. For example, the section entitled A Soldier's Craft and Mastery in Battle, Воинское умение и боевое мастерство, which offers children pearls of wisdom such as one does not battle enemies with empty hands. Голыми руками не биться с врагами. It rhymes in Russian, and of course it means you don't battle enemies with no weapons in hand. And here's another quote: to strike exactly, one needs reconnaissance. One could also translate it as to strike exactly or precisely, one needs the secret services. Here's how it sounds in Russian. Чтобы ударить метко, нужна разведка. In the previous section, we find the quote, we will wait, but we'll take what is ours. Подождем, а свое возьмем. You never know when your child might need that information. He or she must sit and wait until the opportunity arises to go and grab what the child considers is theirs for the taking. The other particularly chilling thing about this children's book is that it is a remake of a book that was published in the Soviet Union in 1958 in the Khrushchev era of vicious persecutions against the faithful. It was published in 1958 under this same title, Жить, Родине служить. The original Khrushchev era book, as a propaganda piece for the indoctrination of children in a militantly atheistic state, did not have the orthodox quotes that grace its 2023 remake by the Moscow Patriarchate. But before I proceed to show you more of such pictures, here is a brief historical footnote on the Russian Church's readiness to serve a state hostile to traditional Christian values, in case you were wondering where all this comes from. While, of course, it goes way back to the beginning of church history, or perhaps even further back to the story of Cain and Abel, in recent times, it comes from the sort of concordat that was established between the first patriarch of the Soviet period, then Metropolitan Sergei Strogorodsky, and the Soviet regime in 1927. Together with his synod at that time, the then Metropolitan Sergei issued a declaration of loyalty to the Soviet regime dated July 16th or 29th, 1927, which proclaimed the following: We want to be orthodox and at the same time to be conscious of the Soviet Union as our civil motherland, whose joys and successes are our joys and successes, and whose failures our failures. Any blow directed at the Union, be it a war, a boycott, some kind of public calamity, or just a treacherous murder, is recognized as a blow aimed at us. While remaining Orthodox, we remember our duty to be citizens of the Union not only out of fear, but also for conscience' sake, as the Apostle teaches us. Romans 13, verse 5. Let's note that when Metropolitan Sergei, or Sergius, and the bishops of his synod made this statement in Stalinist times about their duty to be citizens of an anti-Christian Soviet Union, not only out of fear, but also for conscience sake, everyone knew that this statement was forced and made specifically out of fear and not for conscience sake, not out of conviction. And many bemoaned the Declaration of 1927, refusing to sign it, as Sergius demanded of all bishops in communion with him, both those abroad already that had emigrated, and he demanded that from those within the Soviet Union. So many refused to sign this, either lamenting or condemning Metropolitan Sergei for having been broken by the Soviet authorities. But today, a century later, the primate of this same church, Patriarch Kirill, does not behave as one forced or broken. He rather acts as one who remembers his duty to the state as a conscientious minister thereof. And anybody who is in the least bit familiar with the inner workings and the people within the leadership of the Moscow Patriarchate knows this to be true. The picture shown here of the patriarch grasping the hand of Vladimir Putin with evident devotion is body language that speaks 1,000 words. I will reflect a bit more on what this devotion means almost 100 years after the Sergian Declaration at the end of this paper. Let me also note that the quote from Romans 13, in which St. Paul talks about submission to governing authorities, not only because of wrath or fear, but also for conscience sake, the apostle specifies that he is talking about rulers who foster and serve good and not evil. Here is what St. Paul says in this chapter, Romans 13, about the kind of authorities he is talking about, right after he proclaims in the first verse of this chapter that, quote, there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. End of the quote from Romans 13. I would also like to point out if any of us outside Russia are wondering if there is anything we can do to effect change in the perverse kind of thinking that is prevalent in the Russian Orthodox Church today, that the Sergian Declaration of Loyalty actually begins with complaints about the fact that Russian faithful and their church leaders in the diaspora had hampered the alleged efforts of Patriarch Tikhon, who had died 2 years earlier in 1925 on the Feast of the Annunciation, by the way. Sergius mentions in this declaration that Patriarch Tikhon allegedly failed to gain the trust of the Soviet regime. Here is what the Sergian Declaration says on this matter of the diaspora bishops and faithful being outspoken about the crimes of the Soviet regime and thus preventing such trust being established between the Moscow Church and atheistic state. Quote from the Declaration of Sergius: Unfortunately, various circumstances, mainly words and actions by foreign enemies of the Soviet state, which included not only ordinary faithful of our church, but also their leaders, were the cause of a natural and justified distrust of the government toward the church leaders in general, which hampered the efforts of His Holiness, that is Patriarch Tikhon, and he was not destined to see these efforts, that is to achieve the Soviet regime's trust, bear fruit in his lifetime. End of the quote from the Declaration of Loyalty of Metropolitan Sergius. One might think, as many have thought, that it was a good thing that Metropolitan Sergius secured a place for the church within the Soviet regime. But the way things look now, my friends, a century later, with the thinking of the Moscow Patriarchate having snowballed into being indistinguishable from that of a corrupt regime, we might think twice as to whether this was a good thing for the church. Excuse me that the light is now uneven coming onto my face because the sun has risen here in Vienna, Austria. And I think this is also a nice sign of the hope that the sun always rises again despite the darkness. Forgive me for some of my pathos here. Let's get back to my talk. In fact, if we're thinking that whatever the leadership of the Moscow Patriarch is doing or not doing is a good thing for the church, let's look at just one statistic that recently came out. According to recent statistics published by the Russian Federation's Ministry of Internal Affairs, the number of churchgoers on the Feast of Christmas this year within Russia dropped by an enormous 50% as compared with the number that came to church on Christmas in 2019. That is to say, in 2019, as reported by Interfax, with reference to the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation, 2.6 million came to churches in Russia on Christmas in 2019, whereas in 2024, this year, there were only 1.4 million that came to church on this feast of Christmas. That is just one sign of the fruits of whatever Patriarch Kirill's leadership is leading people to, even as more and more churches are being constructed or built in Russia. I think that we in the so called diaspora might rediscover our role to be a thorn in the side of the perverse marriage between a church and a murderous, corrupt state by testifying to the truth of this marriage, which today produces the kinds of disturbing images, symbols, and messages that we will be looking at next. The symbols of Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine are not always provided with clear explanations by their creators. The best example of this is the first and foremost symbol of this war, the letter Z or Z, which from the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, appeared on Russian tanks and immediately became a symbol of support for the war, even though nobody seemed to know what it means. Still, nobody knows exactly what it means. Russian officials have claimed various meanings for it, including Zelensky and Zapad, that means West in Russian, which I will not review here. And a priest of the Moscow Patriarchate, a very well known pro war priest named Archpriest Andrei Tkachov, said in a telegram post that it means za veru, for faith. But on March 3rd, it was explained in an Instagram post of the Russian Ministry of Defense, whence the symbol does originate. It was explained by the Russian Ministry of Defense as meaning za победу, for victory, which of course left unexplained why a Latin letter would be used to symbolize this by an army allegedly fighting to defend, among other aspects of Ruski Mir or the Russian world, the Russian language. If one looks into the history of the letter Z or Z and its progenitors in ancient languages, one finds that it originally represents a sword or some other kind of weapon, including a phallic symbol, which can be understood as a weapon in cases of rape, of which there were many cases from the outset of this horrible war. For example, the rapes by the Putin regime's army of children and women and men in places like Bucha and elsewhere. The letter Z is borrowed into the Latin alphabet from the Greek zeta, which in the Greek alphabet is a close copy of the Phoenician zayin that resembles the Latin capital letter I. The letter zayin means in Semitic languages a sword or other weapon, as for example in Mishnaic Hebrew. Its connotations are also phallic ones, as one can notice in modern Hebrew slang, in which zayin means the male sexual organ, and there's another very vulgar term connected to the name of this letter, zayin, that means to perform sexual intercourse. I can't say the word in modern day Hebrew because it's so vulgar, only used by men in specific, locker room types of conversations. Be that as it may, while this symbol, allegedly of victory, did not originate specifically in the Russian Orthodox Church, it is frequently embraced in the Russian church context, as in these pictures. For example, this celebration at a church in Omsk. And you can see in the picture here that it says, the Russian church is for the Russian army. Русская церковь за русское воинство. And in this other picture, you can see a priest gently touching the letter Z that is plastered on a car with the caption reading, "This is how an auto parade was blessed in the Krasnodar region. Так в Краснодарском крае благословляли автопробег." And even more absurdly, we can see the letter Z or Z attached to this newly made church onion dome and depicted also here in other pictures on paschal breads called kulichi, that are to be blessed in church at the celebration of Easter or Pascha in 2023. I must mention here that the Ukrainian armed forces have chosen a different symbol to paint on their tanks and other military vehicles, that of the cross. You can see it in these pictures, including a picture of a Ukrainian soldier painting a white cross onto a captured Russian tank on October 3rd, 2022. I point this out, my beloved viewers, not to idealize the Ukrainian armed forces, because there is nothing ideal in warfare, even when it is waged out of the harsh necessity of self defense to fend off invaders, as is the case with the defensive war that Ukraine is compelled to fight today. This kind of necessity is in Greek called ananki, and in Slavonic it is called нужда. In the Orthodox Church, at every service, we pray that the Lord would deliver us from this kind of necessity, that we may be delivered from every sorrow, wrath, and necessity. Apopasis thlipsios, orgis ke anangis, от всякие скорби, гнева и нужды. And in a similar sense, we pray in the Lord's Prayer, as the Lord Himself taught us to pray, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. In other words, but deliver us if or when we do get exposed to temptation, and even when we get entangled or even ensnared in it. But what does the cross signify depicted in the context of military battles, my friends? First of all, it does not signify a weapon of war and violence or a banner that valorizes war and violence. There has indeed been such a misunderstanding or abuse of this symbol time and again in the history of the church, where the meaning of the cross has often been misunderstood and misused, both in the Christian East and in the West. But the cross, in Orthodox understanding, is the weapon of peace, or the instrument of peace oplon irinis, not of war. The cross is called thus weapon of peace or oplon irinis. In the Kontakion of the cross, it is called oplon irinis or weapon of peace, оружие мира. And it is impossible, my friends, to find another meaning for the cross in the history of our salvation, at the center of which is the figure of the crucified and not the crucifier on the cross. Nevertheless, I dare say it is appropriate from the perspective of Orthodox faith and tradition that the cross, precisely as a weapon of peace, is depicted by Christian warriors in prominent places, sometimes on flags or on their clothing and on military vehicles and tanks. Why? To what purpose? So that amid the horrors of war, soldiers would see the sign of the cross, which, while in no wise justifying or valorizing the horrors of war, simultaneously is to humble and to inspire the beholder with hope and faith in the victory of the crucified Lord. The cross and the kind of victory it symbolizes are, on the one hand, a sobering reminder of the man made and man willed evil that invented this horrible weapon of death in the first place, which is the cross in its initial function. On the other hand, it is the sign of the one who overcame this evil by taking it upon himself and leading us to new life through his death, his burial and descent into our hell, and emergence from there in his resurrection. It is a sign of hope in a God who can and does bring light out of darkness and life from death in a way beyond our understanding. Hence, the sign of the cross, which is a sign also in the sense of a miracle, miracle from mirare, or to wonder. A miracle is something that we wonder at, not only that it's, a sign, which you are called to read in the proper way, but you can miss the point if you're reading it wrong. So it's also a sign in the sense of a miracle that encompasses both, on the one hand, the harsh reality of human willed violence and the faith in a God who can and will bring his kind of victory out of it for those who believe in him. For Christians, the cross is the only symbol that really makes sense amid the senseless violence of war, out of which God will deliver his people, those people who choose to be his first and foremost and nobody else's. Such a sign is one of light, which shines also in the darkness and sinister fog of war for those who have been compelled to fight in it and to endure its trauma, also for those who are infected or defiled by its rapacious evil. To fight in a war means to see, hear, and for many people to be infected by its murderous, anti human energies. Being exposed to this evil, even when one is not the attacker but the victim, is traumatizing, soul crippling. Of course, it is that also for the attacker. It requires healing, physical, psychological, and spiritual healing. And the way of that healing is also signified by the cross, specifically because it is the sign of a God who transfigures the bad into the good and brings new life out of death, although this makes no sense outside of faith. It is a matter of faith, this sign and miracle of the cross and of the resurrection, to which the cross is always pointing. As St. Paul says in Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for the good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. This call to redemption, my friends, is extended to all involved in the great travesty of human on human violence, even, I dare say, to the war criminals, because Christ was crucified together with criminals, one to each side of him. This does not, I must stress, elevate the war criminals or equate them with their victims. No, because as we all know, only one of the criminals crucified next to Christ entered the heavenly kingdom with the Lord because this penitent criminal read and accepted the message of the cross in faith. The other criminal only scoffed at the cross, being scandalized by it. My point is, the sign of the cross both reminds and challenges those who see it of or with the message of the crucified one. It is a message of hope to those with the eyes to see it as such, pointing to the way of the healing of the soul from the consequences of war to those who have been entangled in it. But now let's get back to the symbols of the Moscow Patriarchate. Whether or not we accept the official meaning of the Z to be for victory, za победу, it is clear that the concept or even idol of victory, победа in Russian, has become a central focus in the Russian Church's engagement in this war. This brings us to the best known symbol of the Russian Church's idolization of victory, the main cathedral of the Russian armed forces on the outskirts of Moscow. The main cathedral of the Russian armed forces, also called the Cathedral of the Resurrection of Christ, is a patriarchal cathedral built between September 2018 and May 2020 in the Patriot Park in the Odintsovsky district on the outskirts of Moscow. This church can be described as a temple to victory. Consecrated on June 14th, 2020, it was, and I quote, dedicated to the 75th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War, as well as the military feats of the Russian people in all wars. End of that quote. I could talk a lot about the symbolism of the church structure, which is intended in its enormous size, exact measurements, materials of which it is constructed, and in its iconography to celebrate the victories, specifically the military victories of the Soviet and Russian military, particularly the so called Great Victory in World War II, known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War. For example, the floors of the cathedral are metal, made from melted down trophies of Nazis, like tanks and weapons seized from the Nazi forces in World War II. When one walks on this floor, it is meant to symbolize victory over the Nazis. The drum of the main dome of the church measures in its diameter 19.45 meters, which symbolizes the year in which the war ended, 1945. The small dome's height is 14.18 meters, symbolizing the 1,418 nights that open conflict lasted between the USSR and Nazi Germany, and so on. The cathedral is said to contain Adolf Hitler's cap and personal clothes, which were described by a Russian deputy minister of defense, Timur Ivanov, as true relics, настоящие реликвии, in a televised interview on the Russian TV channel Zvezda on June 11th, 2020, which caused an uproar on Russian social media. The official press office of the Ministry of Defense later talked back this statement, saying that the deputy minister did not mean to call Hitler's clothes relics and that his statement was torn out of context. In fact, several features of the cathedral have been removed after causing public scandal. For example, a mosaic that included Putin, Shoigu, General Gerasimov, and others, which was meant to celebrate, as the rector of the cathedral, Bishop Stefan Privalov of Klin explained, the role of these political leaders in accomplishing the annexation of Crimea. Another mosaic that caused scandal and was removed as a result was one that featured a victory parade with a portrait of Joseph Stalin. The mosaic was removed from the church because it caused such a scandal and was placed instead in a museum next to the church. Nonetheless, the cathedral itself continues to cause scandal as it appears to be a temple to war or to some kind of a war god. I think, as I already said, that it is a temple to victory, which is being idolized or deified, as was, for example, the goddess Nike or Nike in antiquity and in Greek mythology. But one journalist, Alexander Goltz, called it, this church, a temple to victory over the church. He pointed out that the purpose of going to such a church is not prayer to God, but to affirm or reaffirm a willingness to engage in military aggression in the interests of the Russian state. Goltz quotes in this context the Minister of Defense, Sergei Kozogetovich Shoigu, as saying precisely this about the Cathedral of the Armed Forces. I am absolutely sure, Shoigu is quoted as saying, that all who come here will be reminded of the great feats or podvigi, that's like feats in combination with the concept of sacrifice, the great podvigi of the past, and will be preparing for those of the future. Here's how that sounded in Russian. Я абсолютно уверен, что все те, кто будет приходить сюда, будут вспоминать о прошлых подвигах и готовиться к будущим. But let's move on and turn to the sacred relics and icons for or to victory. As we turn to other sorts of symbols of or for victory, we're turning to certain relics and icons that were promulgated as such by the Moscow Patriarchate. I mean, certain sacred icons and saints' relics, which Patriarch Kirill has brought to public attention since the beginning of the full scale war against Ukraine, explicitly as a sign of God's help or attention to the Russian military on the Ukrainian front. The first of these was the Avgustov icon of the Mother of God, gifted by the Patriarch on March 13th, 2022, in the Church of Christ the Savior to the then director of the Russian National Guard, or Rosgvardia, Viktor Zolotov. Presenting the icon as a gift to the National Guard, the Patriarch told the story of how this icon first appeared in 1914 at the beginning of World War I and saved the life of a certain Russian soldier. Zolotov thanked the Patriarch, first saying how things were going at the front and completing his little speech with several words about victory. I'm quoting what Zolotov said on this occasion. Victory will be ours, and this icon will be protecting the Russian army and will speed up our victory. Победа будет за нами, и эта икона будет защищать русское воинство и ускорит нашу победу, he said. Now, I don't know if the icon helped Zolotov, but he disappeared from public view soon after receiving this gift, and he's been sanctioned both by the European Union and the US for his involvement in this war. He was also actually sanctioned previously for human rights violations and suppressing violently certain protests in the streets of Moscow. But let's move on. Other icons and relics that came into the possession of the Russian Orthodox Church in 2023 are discussed as signs in Patriarch Kirill's televised Christmas interview on the state supported Channel 1 that aired on January 7th of this year, 2024. The interviewer asked the Patriarch about these good signs, or dobre znaki, of 2023, and indicated that he means specifically, number one, the handing over to the Russian Orthodox Church of the famous Andrei Rublev icon of the Trinity, previously kept in the Tretiakov Gallery in Moscow. Number two, the ostensibly miraculous way that Patriarch Kirill discovered in a storage room in one of his residences near Moscow what he claimed to be the original Kazan icon of the Theotokos, as I will explain in more detail below. And number three, the decision of the Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation to return the reliquary of St. Alexander Nevsky from the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg to the Russian Orthodox Church in May of 2023. The patriarch in this interview responded to the journalist's question about these good signs, dobrые знаки, that one cannot overestimate the significance of these, all three of which he interprets in a politically expedient manner as somehow being helpful to Russia at the present time of war and economic insecurity. The most obvious example of the patriarch's politically expedient signs is the story of his discovery, as I already said, of the Kazan icon in a storage room in one of his residences. He announced this discovery at a liturgy in the Dormition Cathedral in the Kremlin on November 4th, 2023. November 4th, by the way, is both the feast day of the Kazan icon and the Day of National Unity, or День народного единства. Instituted by the Putin regime in 2005, this new national holiday commemorates the uprising of the Russian people that expelled Polish-Lithuanian occupation forces from Moscow in November of 1612. The patriarch claimed that experts he had consulted confirmed to him that the icon he found in his storage room was the original, in front of which Minin and Pozharsky, who were leaders of the national uprising against the foreigners, prayed in the early 17th century. Note that the press office of the Moscow Patriarchate quickly clarified that the Kazan icon discovered by the patriarch was actually one of the early Moscow copies of the original. That notwithstanding, my friends, here is what the patriarch said on November 4th. One can consider this event an historic event. We see before our eyes the original of the wonder-working icon of the Kazan Mother of God, in front of which Pozharsky and Minin prayed, and which saved our people from foreign intervention and from God knows what consequences of this intervention. От иностранной интервенции и неизвестно от каких последствий этой интервенции. The political point that Patriarch Kirill found it necessary to accentuate, in case anybody had missed it, was that the Kazan icon had been helpful to the victory of the Russian people, specifically against foreign intervention, specifically one that came from the West, and even more specifically, my friends, from forces none other than of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, of which Ukraine happened to be a part at that time. Thus, Patriarch Kirill's historic discovery of the Kazan icon in November of 2023, no less, during the Putin regime's war against Ukraine, was not just a sign of the help of the Mother of God to people in general, or even to Russian people in general. It was a sign of the Mother of God's leading Russian people to victory against the West and against Ukraine. So, for Putin's Russia, the patriarch produced a politically correct kind of miracle at the politically correct time. A similar case is the decision of Russia's Ministry of Culture to return to the church in the Alexander Nevsky Lavra in St. Petersburg the reliquary of St. Alexander Nevsky from the Hermitage Museum, where the precious reliquary covered with silver had been housed since the Soviet authorities seized it, together with the relics of the saint, in 1922. The reliquary was since housed in the Hermitage, while the relics of the saint were, throughout the Soviet era, in a museum of religion and atheism. While the relics themselves were returned to the Russian Church in 1989, the reliquary remained until now, the end of 2023, in the Hermitage Museum, where it has been undergoing restoration. In 2021, Patriarch Kirill publicly demanded the return also of the silver reliquary to the Russian Orthodox Church, a demand that was first resisted by officials of the museum and art experts who thought that this would not be good for the preservation of this monument. But the demand of the patriarch was finally met by the Ministry of Culture in May of 2023, as I already said, and that was already 15 months into Russia's unsuccessful efforts to subject Ukraine through its full scale invasion. We should note, my friends, that St. Alexander Nevsky is especially inspiring for the anti Western focus of today's Moscow Patriarchate and the Putin regime, because Alexander Nevsky is best known for his victories over Swedish, that is, Western invaders. He is also known for having preserved separate statehood and orthodoxy by agreeing to pay tribute to the powerful Golden Horde that came from the East, which is not entirely unlike Russia's present day relationship with China. So, the return of this reliquary, a word I am not sure how to pronounce in case you didn't notice, to the Russian Orthodox Church is not only a political victory for Patriarch Kirill within the power structures of the Putin regime, it is also highly symbolic in light of the sort of anti Western message of the life of this saint. Here is what the director of the Hermitage Museum said about the museum's decision to return the reliquary to the church. And I quote the director of the museum: "The Hermitage bases its decision on the fact that, at the present geopolitical moment, the connection of the relics with the reliquary on the territory of the Lavra has special meaning for the fate of the country and for social peace in it. Today, the sacral significance of the monument is more important than its artistic value. Сегодня сакральное значение памятника важнее его художественной ценности." Now let's go on to the topic of how the God of victory demands human sacrifices. I will next discuss the war prayer composed by Patriarch Kirill entitled The Prayer for Holy Rus, and commonly known as the Prayer for Victory. The patriarch first publicly read this prayer at a liturgy in the skeet of St. Alexander Nevsky near his estate in Peredelkina on September 25th, 2022, soon after the beginning of Putin's so called partial mobilization that was announced on September 21st. There was another unpleasant surprise at this particular liturgy of September 25th, when at the end of it, the patriarch said in his sermon that we believe that the sacrifice of a soldier who dies in this war out of fidelity to the soldier's oath is a sacrifice that, quote, washes away all the sins that the person committed. End of the quote from the patriarch's sermon. Thus, he did elevate to the status of martyrs those who die and also kill in a war of aggression out of fidelity to an oath. According to this logic, I'm just saying this parenthetically because we're going to get back to the prayer for victory. But according to this logic about sticking to one's oath, one might also see King Herod's fidelity to his oath spoken in a drunken way at his birthday party to give the daughter of his lover anything she might ask for, which led to the beheading of John the Baptist. One might see that as a virtuous thing as well. In any event, we could see that at this point, just 4 days after the Putin regime announced so called partial mobilization, the patriarch ramped up his rhetoric in support of the war, adding the promise of all sins being washed away for those who die in it and kill in it, and also the new prayer for victory, to which we now return. So the new prayer actually was a modification of an earlier prayer that was called the Prayer for the Reinstatement of Peace, which had been ratified by the patriarch himself on March 3rd, 2022, soon after the beginning of the war. Parts of the earlier prayer for the reinstatement of peace are contained in the new prayer for Holy Rus. So that's why I said that the new prayer is a modification of that previous one. Priests and bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate within the Russian Federation are obliged to read this prayer, the new one, the prayer for victory, aloud, and to read it exactly, word for word, in the middle of every divine liturgy after this litany or sugubaya intensive iktsinya. The prayer has become both a sign and a test of loyalty for Moscow Patriarchate priests within Russia to the geopolitical agenda of the Putin regime and the Moscow Patriarchate that serves that regime, especially to the part of that agenda that is victory in the war against Ukraine. This is because the prayer spells out this agenda in no uncertain terms, as one can notice just by reading its beginning. Here's how the beginning of the prayer goes: O Lord God of powers, God of our salvation, look down in mercy on your humble servants. Hear us and have mercy on us. For behold, those who desire conflict have taken up arms, Apolchishasa, against Holy Rus, yearning to divide and destroy her one people. Arise, O God, to help your people and grant us victory by your power. Note that the one people of Holy Rus, to Patriarch Kirill's mind, are those of at least three countries, that is, of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. The patriarch has stated this vision many times. So, this part of the prayer, as well as its premise that Ukraine and Russia, together with Belarus, form one people of Holy Rus, make the prayer unacceptable to Ukrainians and to anyone really with a firm grasp on reality. No offense to anyone with no firm grasp on reality, of course. For this reason, some priests of the Moscow Patriarchate have not been willing to read this new prayer either at all or as it stands, and some have been replacing the word victory with the word peace and have been either removed from their parish or even defrocked for that. That is, stripped of the priesthood, which is an incredibly harsh penalty by any standard in our church. The best known case of a priest being defrocked for replacing the word victory with the word peace in this prayer is that of Father Ion Koval, a parish priest originally from the Lugansk region in Ukraine, but serving until recently in the Moscow area of Lublino, that is, in Patriarch Kirill's Moscow diocese. One of Father Jan's parishioners reported him to the diocesan authorities. That's become a big thing now, once again, in Russia, reporting on one another, even on one's priest. After which, Patriarch Kirill issued a decree on February 2nd, 2023, stating that Father Ion is forbidden to do any priestly ministry until the diocesan court decides whether he should be defrocked. That is, as I already explained, stripped of the priesthood entirely. On May 13th, 2023, the so called church court ruled to defrock Father Ioan, allegedly for breaking the vows that he pronounced at his ordination to be obedient to his church superiors. The church canon that the court selected to back that up with was Canon 25 of the Holy Apostles, which the so called church court misinterpreted in a tendentious way, as I will be explaining in a minute. But here let me point out that it was not the word of God nor the teaching of the Orthodox Church against which Father Ioan trespassed. It was against Patriarch Kirill's word, specifically the word victory, as understood by him in the prayer that the patriarch himself concocted. A more recent case of a defrocking was that of a well known and particularly beloved Moscow priest, He's very beloved and popular, especially but not only in Russian Orthodox intelligentsia circles. It was the Moscow priest and author Father Alexei Uminsky, with whom I have crossed paths several times. I'm very privileged to have done so. Anyway, he was defrocked just recently on January 13th, 2024, for allegedly, as the church court ruled, the so called church court, refusing to fulfill the patriarchal blessing to read the prayer for Holy Rus. In Father Alexei's case, the court again referred to the above mentioned Canon 25 of the Holy Apostles, which the court misinterpreted in its own way. And adding insult to injury, the patriarch replaced Father Alexei as rector at his parish of the Holy Trinity in the Khokhly area of Moscow with none other than the already mentioned Father Andrei Tkachov, a Ukrainian born priest himself, infamous or very popular, depending on whom you ask, for his very anti Ukrainian, pro war propagandizing, and for all sorts of other things like very misogynistic statements. His campaign against vaccination and mask wearing during the COVID pandemic, and other things. A further recent case of defrocking of a well known priest of the Moscow Patriarchate, not specifically for not reading the prayer for victory, but for outspoken criticism of the role of Patriarch Kirill and others in the Moscow Patriarchate in the war against Ukraine, was that of the renowned theologian, author, and professor of Orthodox theology and beloved friend of mine, Archimandrite Cyril Govorun. Patriarch Kirill's decision to defrock Father Cyril Havarun, issued on January 17th, 2024, was also based on Canon 25 of the Holy Apostles and is also utterly uncanonical for this reason. So let us next turn to this Canon 25 of the Holy Apostles, which, similar to Patriarch Kirill's prayer for victory, has also been weaponized against clergy not loyal to Patriarch Kirill and the victory he is trying very hard to serve. Canon 25 is from a set, my friends, if you don't know about these canons, it's from a set of pseudo epigraphical canons attributed to the Holy Apostles, but dating to the later 4th century. Canon 25 prescribes for priests the penalty of defrocking, of being stripped of the priestly office, for several sins, including, as the canon reads in Russian and Slavonic, klятво преступления, which literally means oath trespassing or oath breaking. This is the part of Canon 25 to which the Moscow so called church court has been referring in its cases against priests disloyal to Patriarch Kirill's war effort, finding the priests guilty of breaking the oath they took at their ordination, specifically the one about obedience to their church hierarchy. Please note that clerics also promise, not only at ordination, but already in holy baptism, to be faithful to Christ and his word, as do all Orthodox Christians. The first problem with the Moscow Patriarchate's current interpretation of Canon 25 is that the word klятва преступления, or oath trespassing, which in its Greek original is epiorkia, does not mean disobedience to any oath or a failure to fulfill an oath of obedience. The word actually means perjury or lying under oath or during the taking of the oath, as one can easily find in any Greek lexicon. Just look up epiorkia. It is also translated into Latin as periurio or perjury in the Latin version of this Canon 25 of the Holy Apostles, and also in the Vulgate Latin version of the New Testament when the word occurs there in the New Testament. Father Cyril Havarun has indicated all this in his own defense in a Facebook post on his personal page from January 18th, 2024. Here is what Father Cyril wrote in this post. The etymology itself of this word, epiorkia, testifies to this meaning. It literally means that which occurs at, epi, the taking of the oath, orkia, that is, at that time of the oath, and not after it. In this way, the canon condemned those clerics that consciously bore false witness in the courtroom or in other juridical processes of Roman jurisprudence. This explains the need for clerics to take an oath at all, although it contradicted Christ's commandment not to take oaths. It was necessitated by Roman law. The irony of all this is that the judges of the church court, who are violating judicial procedures, are actually more subject to the penalties described by Canon 25 than those that they are trying to judge on the basis of this canon. That's the end of the quote from Father Cyril's post. I could add that you could find other canons that do demand that the judges in a church court, in this case, they're all priests of the Moscow diocese, that they need to be impartial and not motivated by godless motivations. Just look at the first canon of the patron saint of this Father Cyril Havarun, Cyril of Alexandria. First canon of Cyril of Alexandria talks about it being fully reasonable and according to church phronima or thinking that judges be impartial and motivated in the right way and in sync with the grace of God and the building up of the church, and opposite kinds of motivations. Anyway, back to Canon 25 of the Holy Apostles. I do not know if it's the ignorance of canon law that is displayed by Patriarch Kirill and his so called church court, if this is a willful kind of ignorance, or is it one due to a lack of education in canon law? I suspect it is both. But, and here's the thing, please pay attention to this part, my friends, if you're still with me. This interpretation of Canon 25, as if the canon intends to oblige clerics to obey without question anything and everything their superiors might command, once the clerics have taken an oath to do so, does reveal a stark dissonance with the conviction of the holy apostles themselves that, quote, we ought to obey God rather than men, end of quote, of what St. Peter and the other apostles proclaimed in Acts 5:29. We ought to obey God rather than men. That's from the mouths of the apostles themselves. But the not apostolic attitude, which is the second and main problem with the Moscow Patriarchate's interpretation of Canon 25 of the Holy Apostles, goes hand in hand with the misinterpretation of Romans 13, verse 5, in the 1927 Sergian Declaration of Loyalty to the state regime, as if St. Paul commanded to be loyal to any state authority, whatever it may be doing or saying, and however this may be, violating the word of the church's primary authority, God, and however destructive this may be to the church and to the people of God. Another central aspect of the Russian Orthodox Church's service to the Putin regime is its propagating a vision of Holy Russia as being both special, with a special mission, and being the undervalued and mistreated ex partner and now victim of the global West. To outsiders, the Russian regime and church express this resentful mentality through rude and manipulative forms of self affirmation, through isolationism, and in the worst case, through military aggression. As for insiders, if they oppose this culture of resentment in word or deed, both the regime and the church are persecuting them with increasing vigor. One of the most sinister signs of this development, of a once church of the martyrs turning into a church that is the persecutor of the confessors and martyrs, was the law against the hurting of the feelings of the faithful, of оскорбление чувств верующих. This law was inserted as Article 148 into the Penal Codex of the Russian Federation on June 29th, 2013. That was in the wake of the trial and imprisonment of the Pussy Riot group for dancing and singing an anti Putin prayer in Moscow's main cathedral of Christ the Savior. Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov of Simferopol and Crimea is probably the most influential and hence dangerous voice in the Russian Orthodox Church who embraces the victim narrative about Russia, complete with anti Western conspirology and quotes of elders who predicted all of it, including Russia's practically inevitable, in his rendition, invasion of Ukraine. One can see his views, Metropolitan Tikhon's views, on full display in a fairly recent interview with Ksenia Sobchak, which aired on YouTube on May 15th, 2023. And when I last checked, it had 1.3 million views. All this notwithstanding, Metropolitan Tikhon is very respected in Russia, even among highly educated clergymen who regard him as a man of genuine faith and extraordinary talents. I can't argue with that, as it is not possible for me to evaluate the faith of another human being, but the words used to articulate faith and the damage that they do to the teaching of the church is something that is another thing. And this all brings me to my final reflections about the banality and even respectability of this kind of evil when it is distorting to almost being unrecognizable the teaching of the church, and when it takes hold of an entire church or society and becomes the norm or the canon. Because you see, the meaning of the word canon and canonical signalizes initially a measuring stick or a standard by which one judges whether this or that behavior, word, or action is acceptable and desirable for the church, for church being, and for church functioning. So let's look at the banality of evil when all of the above becomes canonical. The above described state of affairs in the Russian Orthodox Church, in which good is punished and evil is rewarded, where war is sanctified while praying for peace is penalized, where an aggressor is the victim and a victim the aggressor, where the most free voices are slapped down through unjust judges, displaying willful ignorance of the law of God, is reminiscent of the Orwellian war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And the fact that most people in the Russian Orthodox Church accept this dystopian reality as canonical, that is normal, and as customary, while, as the Russians say, everybody understands everything, все все понимают, makes me think of Hannah Arendt's observations on the banality of evil in her well known 1963 book about the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. The sinister, duplicitous reality described in my paper today is often served and supported by hardworking parish priests who do their duties diligently before their church authority, country, and family, not entirely unlike the Nazi Adolf Eichmann did. If I can insert a personal note here, I'm thinking of Father Vladislav Tsipin as an example, a nice man whom I encountered many times at meetings of the Moscow Patriarchate's Commission for Canon Law of the Intercouncil Presence of the Moscow Patriarchate. Father Vladislav often has a smile on his face, and he's hardworking and always punctual to meetings. And he once kindly let me use his phone. This was a very old, like flip kind of mobile phone, when mine was not working once in Moscow. At the same time, Father Vladislav is deputy chairman of the so-called Moscow Church Court, which issued the above described harsh sentences of defrocking to fellow priests. He also recently published a theological rationale, as it's been described, for the Russian Church's support for the war in Ukraine. This article of his is entitled Special Operation in the Light of the Christian Doctrine of War and Peace, and it can be found on the pravoslavia.ru website. But now, finally, let's get to why I think this whole picture is liberating and it's a time of growth and hope nonetheless. I would not see the future of my church quite as pessimistically as Orwell ended his book, 1984, in which Winston, the main character, ends up happily conformed. In Christianity, specifically in the Christianity that believes in something called church, both in theory and practice, there is incomparably more faith in humanity, which Christ entrusted with the theory and practice of being church. This phenomenon, called church or ekklesia in Greek, which comes from the verb ekkaleo, that means to call out or call forth, signifies the communion of those who are called out. As church, we are called out and challenged to walk through time on the way of the cross, which is always leading to new life and to new light. And in this light, we keep growing and progressing as Christians. And a time of church crisis, as the present time, is a time of increasing growth through clarity because the darkness has become so obvious that it presses us to stretch towards light. The masks are off, my friends, if previously anybody thought they were real faces or faces that can be trusted. And this is liberating to see clearly where and with whom one ought to stand, for whom and what it is worth fighting, and who and what need to be stopped and brought to justice. A church crisis challenges its contemporaries to make a choice between two possible ways. One way is to accept defeat by either conforming or feigning ignorance, or accepting the banality of evil as something inevitable and common to every place and time and religion, as if the banality of evil is the norm or the canon according to which the church lives. Or this accepting defeat can come in the form of leaving the church altogether and checking out. But the second way that one can take, presented with this choice or this critical moment that is a crisis, the second way, the second choice is to do what is necessary to change and to heal, accepting personal, dignifying responsibility for this changing and healing process. If we see our church leaders and also ourselves as church, because we're all part of one body, my friends, the church leaders aren't here and we're here. We are one body. If we see ourselves serving injustice and false gods, not out of fear, but out of conscience, as it says in the Sergian Declaration, it is vital that we work on a healing of our church conscience and consciousness, on a correction of our vision, of our understanding of the true meaning of our sacred symbols, on our understanding of what is normal for the church, what is the canon for the church, and what is truly canonical, and that we work on our capacity for discernment of light from darkness in general. We can work on this first within ourselves on a daily basis, and when or if we are called to bear testimony to the truth before others, we can bear testimony to the truth for the good of ourselves and others in the big ship that is, our church. And I think that if we know the truth and do not speak it, we might experience the kind of thing that happened on that ship that carried the prophet Jonah when he was being silent and not speaking the word that God had given him to speak. The whole ship, in that case, began to sink. Then Jonah was thrown overboard and descended into the belly of a big fish, which felt to Jonah like hell. But Jonah was preserved by God, and he ended up whole and able to accomplish his mission through his experience and resulting repentance. My point is that even if we end up being thrown overboard, even by our own church, as we go through the process of wrestling with the sometimes unpleasant truths of God's word, we need not fear, my friends, because we will be preserved by God to our own betterment and to his greater glory and for the good, ultimately, of the church of God. Because he is the one who saves us, he is the one who saves the church, not us. It is not the human being that saves the church. Не человек спасает церковь, we chant in my church's hymnography to the new martyrs and confessors of Russia, that is the Rokor's hymnography to the new martyrs and confessors of Russia, whom we will be celebrating soon, February 4th, if you're older calendar. I'm also reminded for all involved in the horrors of this ongoing war of the ever present on our journey of faith sign of the cross, and the words of the penitent thief who said at his own darkest and also brightest hour, "Remember me, Lord, when you come into your kingdom." These are my thoughts, my friends, and my hope that I wanted to share with you as we face this time of growth in our church's history, both outside of Russia and inside it. Please don't forget to leave a like underneath this video and do share your thoughts in the comments underneath the video. And also, I want to remind you that we do have a conference coming up in Chicago about all of this on February 17th and 18th. One day will be all in Russian and the other day will be all in English. The conference is called We're Not Alone. It'll be on all of these topics. And another speaker there besides me will be Sergei Chepnin. So check out at the link provided here. In my speaking schedule, there are details about this conference coming up February 17th and 18th in Wheeling, Illinois. I would love to see you there. So check that out. And that's it for me for today. Bye, everyone.